At my husband's funeral, I overheard my daughter-in-law whisper, "Hurry up with the inheritance, eBay already made plans for this house." Didn't they cry? Didn't they turn around? I just stood there, holding the same white handkerchief they'd been clutching since the service began, and for the first time in 52 years of marriage, I realized I had been surrounded by strangers. The church smelled of lilies and polished wood, the kind of scent that's supposed to feel peaceful, but that morning it felt heavy, almost suffocating, like the air itself knew something I didn't. Friends and distant relatives filled the pews, their voices low and respectful, offering condolences that floated past me like background noise. I nodded when expected, shook hands when necessary, and kept my posture straight, just the way my husband, Richard Collins, had always admired. He used to say I carried myself like a woman who knew her place in the world. Standing there beside his casket, I realized that place might have already been taken from me. Olivia's voice had been soft, almost sweet, the kind of tone she used when she didn't want to be overheard, which made it all the more jarring that I had caught every word. She stood just a few feet behind me, speaking to someone I couldn't see, probably one of her friends who had no real reason to be there other than curiosity. I didn't need to turn around to know the expression on her face. He had seen it before in quieter moments, when she thought no one was paying attention. It was a look of calculation, not grief. A look that measured value instead of memories. I kept my eyes forward, focused on the polished wood of Richard's casket, tracing the reflection of the stained glass windows across its surface. 52 years. That was how long we had built a life together in that house Olivia was already claiming as her own. Every creak in the floorboards, every mark on the kitchen counter, every rose bush in the backyard had a story attached to it, and yet to her, it was just square footage and resale value. I pressed the handkerchief tighter in my palm until the fabric bunched between my fingers, but my face remained calm, composed, untouched by the storm rising quietly inside me. Around me, people began to stand as the pastor prepared to speak. The soft shuffle of shoes against the wooden floor echoing through the sanctuary. I followed their lead, moving slowly, deliberately, aware of Olivia's presence behind me, aware that she believed she was already stepping into a life that didn't belong to her. Daniel, my son, stood across the aisle, his expression distant, his attention fixed somewhere over my shoulder rather than on me. He hadn't looked at me once since the service began. Not when I walked in, not when I sat down. Not even now, as we stood just feet apart saying goodbye to the man who had held this family together for decades. He wondered, not for the first time, how long he had been standing beside her instead of me. Through the hallway. But there was nothing. Just quiet. Alone, stretched kind of quiet that made every small movement sound louder than it should. He walked slowly into the living room, my heels soft against the hardwood floors, and paused when I noticed something that had not been there that morning. A stack of folders sat neatly arranged on the coffee table, perfectly squared, as if placed with intention rather than accident. He did not need to open them to know what they were. Olivia had always liked things organized when it came to money. She called it being efficient. He called it something else. I reached out and touched the top folder lightly, running my fingers along the edge, and then withdrew my hand as if the paper itself might reveal more than I was ready to see. From the kitchen, I could hear faint voices, low and controlled, the kind of conversation people have when they think they are being careful. Olivia and Daniel. He stood still, just long enough to listen without appearing to listen, catching fragments of words that drifted down the hallway like pieces of a puzzle that had already been assembled without me. Deadlines. Paperwork. Market value. The words did not belong in this house, not today, not yet. He stepped into the kitchen doorway with the same composed expression I had worn all morning, and both of them fell silent almost instantly. Olivia turned first, her face softening into that practiced smile she had perfected over the years, the one that never quite reached her eyes. Daniel glanced at me a moment later, his posture stiff, as if he had been caught somewhere he should not be. He gave them a small nod, nothing more, and moved past them toward the sink, placing my hands on the cool marble countertop as if grounding myself in something familiar. The sunlight streamed in through the window above the sink, illuminating the tiny dust particles in the air, and for a moment, I focused on that instead of the tension behind me. It was easier that way. You should rest, Olivia said after a beat, her voice gentle, almost concerned. It has been a long day. He nodded again, still facing the window, still calm. It has, I replied quietly. My voice did not shake. It did not need to. Bane me, I could feel. Here watching, cheering, waiting for some sign that I was fragile, that I was overwhelmed, that I was exactly who she believed me to be. But I had spent too many years learning how to hold myself together in moments that threatened to pull everything apart. I turned slowly, meeting her gaze just long enough to acknowledge her presence, and then looked at Daniel. Your father always said this house would take care of us, I said, my tone even, reflective, as if speaking to memory rather than accusation. Daniel shifted slightly, his eyes flickering with something that might have been discomfort, but it passed quickly. Olivia's smile remained, steady and composed. And it will, she said softly. He held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, letting the silence stretch just enough to feel intentional, and then I gave the smallest nod, as if agreeing with her. Back in Side, something had already begun to settle into place, quiet and deliberate, like the first move in a game they did not realize I had started playing. That evening, I sat alone in the bedroom that had once felt like the center of my life, now reduced to a quiet space filled with echoes. Richard's side of the bed was still untouched, the pillow slightly indented the way it had been the morning he left for the hospital and never came back. He had not moved it. He was not ready to erase the last trace of something that had been constant for more than 5 decades. The late afternoon light slipped through the curtains in thin golden lines, stretching across the floor and stopping just short of where I sat at the edge of the bed. He rested my hands in my lap, fingers folded neatly, and stared at the dresser across the room where our wedding photo still stood in its silver frame. We looked younger there, of course, but more than that, we looked certain. Certain of each other. Certain of the life we were building together. I stood slowly and walked toward the dresser, picking up the frame with steady hands. My reflection hovered faintly over the glass, layered on top of the 2 people we used to be. For a moment, I let myself remember the sound of his voice, the way he would stand in this very room every morning, adjusting his tie and asking me if it looked straight, even though he already knew it did. Richard had always been careful. Not just in the way he dressed or the way he spoke, but in the way he planned. He believed in preparing for things before they happened, in making sure the people he loved would be protected even when he could no longer stand beside them. That thought lingered longer than the memory itself, settling quietly in the back of my mind like something waiting to be understood. Downstairs, I could hear movement again. Cabinets opening. Drawers closing. Olivia had not wasted time making herself comfortable in a house that was not hers to claim. The sound did not upset me the way it might have earlier that day. Instead, it sharpened something inside me, bringing a kind of clarity that had been missing before. I set the photograph back in its place with care, aligning it precisely the way it had always been, and turned toward the closet. Inside, everything was exactly as Richard had left it. His jackets hung in perfect order, his shoes lined neatly beneath them, his presence preserved in fabric and leather and quiet routine. I reached out and brushed my fingers along the sleeve of his navy suit, the one he had worn to Daniel's wedding, the one Olivia had admired more than once for its quality. He always had good taste, she had said back then, her voice light, her smile polite. He remembered that moment now with a different understanding. He closed the closet door gently and returned to the bed, sitting down once more, but this time I did not feel as still. He leaned slightly forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and allowed my thoughts to move beyond memory into something more deliberate. The folders on the coffee table. The whispered conversation. The careful way Olivia had watched me in the kitchen, waiting for weakness that never came. It was all too organized to be impulsive. These had been planned. Not in a rush, not in grief, but in patience. And if it had been planned, then there would be details. Steps. Expectations. He lifted my gaze toward the window, watching as the last of the sunlight faded into evening, and for the first time since the service, I felt something settle firmly into place. He had spent the entire day being observed, measured, quietly assessed. But what they did not understand was that I had been watching too. And unlike them, I had learned a long time ago that the most important things are never said out loud. They are revealed in timing, in silence, in the small decisions people believe no one else notices. He stood again, smoothing my skirt with practiced ease, and took a slow breath, steady and controlled. He was not rushing. He was not reacting. He was simply beginning to see the shape of something that had been hidden in plain sight. And once you see something clearly, you cannot pretend it is not there. Not anymore. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of quiet that settles over a house before anyone admits that something has changed. He was already awake when the first light crept through the curtains, casting a pale glow across the ceiling. He had not slept much, but I did not feel tired. There was a difference between exhaustion and clarity, and what I felt now was something far sharper than either. He moved through my usual routine with deliberate precision, making coffee the same way I had every morning for years, measuring the grounds, pouring the water, waiting for the familiar sound to fill the kitchen. The rhythm of it grounded me, reminded me that some things still followed a pattern, even when everything else had begun to shift. When I carried my cup into the dining room, I noticed that the folders from the night before were no longer on the coffee table. They had been moved, not removed, just relocated with intention. He did not need to search long to find them. Olivia had placed them on the sideboard beneath the large mirror, as if displaying them rather than hiding them. It was a small detail, but it told me everything I needed to know. This was not about discretion. This was about control. He set my coffee down and stepped closer, my reflection appearing behind the neat stack of papers, steady and composed. For a moment, I simply looked at them, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of what they represented settle into something I could hold without reacting. Then I reached out and opened the top folder. In C there were property estimates, recent valuations, notes about market trends, all neatly organized, all prepared in advance. That is from weeks ago, some from months. I turned a page slowly, scanning the numbers, the annotations, the careful handwriting that was not mine. They had been planning this long before Richard was gone. That realization did not hit me all at once. It unfolded gradually, like a door opening just enough to reveal what had been hidden behind it. He closed the folder gently and returned it to its place, aligning the edges exactly as I had found them. There was no need to disturb anything. Not yet. Footsteps approached from the hallway, measured and unhurried. Olivia entered first, her posture relaxed, her expression already arranged into that familiar mask of concern. Daniel followed a moment later, quieter, watching me with a look that seemed to search for something he could not quite name. "You are up early," Olivia said, her voice light, as if we were discussing nothing more than the weather. He gave a small nod. "I have always preferred mornings," I replied, my tone even, almost conversational. He turned slightly, allowing my gaze to pass over the folders without lingering, then back to her. "There is something I would like to discuss," I added, calmly, as if the idea had only just occurred to me. Olivia's eyes flickered for the briefest second, a shift so subtle it would have been easy to miss if I had not been looking for it. "Of course," she said quickly, stepping closer. "We were actually thinking the same thing. It might be best to start organizing things sooner rather than later." He let a quiet pause settle between us, just long enough to feel intentional, then inclined my head slightly, as if agreeing. "Yes," I said softly. "Sooner might be best." Daniel shifted his weight, his hands moving into his pockets, his gaze dropping momentarily before returning to me. There was hesitation there, but not enough to change anything. Not enough to stop what had already begun. He reached for my coffee again, lifting the cup with steady hands, and took a small sip before setting it back down. "Why do not we sit down later this afternoon?" I continued, my voice calm, measured, "and go over everything together?" Olivia smiled then, a little wider this time, a little less careful. "That sounds like a good idea," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, just long enough to acknowledge her satisfaction, and then I nodded once more. Because what she did not realize, what neither of them understood, was that by the time we sat down at that table, I would already know exactly what they were expecting. And more importantly, I would know exactly how to let them believe they were getting it. The afternoon settled over the house with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. He set the dining table with quiet precision, placing 3 plates exactly where they had always gone, aligning the silverware, smoothing the tablecloth until not a single crease remained. It was the same routine I had followed for years, the same attention to detail that had once made this house feel like a home. Now it served a different purpose. It gave me time. It gave me control. When Olivia walked in, she noticed everything immediately. She always did. Her eyes moved across the table, taking in the arrangement, the order, the subtle signal that this conversation would not be rushed or casual. You did not have to go through all this trouble, she said, her tone light, but there was something sharper beneath it. He gave a small, polite smile. Some conversations deserve a proper setting, I replied, my voice calm, steady. Daniel entered a moment later, quieter than before, his gaze lingering on the table for just a second before shifting to me. There was tension in the way he held himself, but he said nothing. We sat down together, the soft scrape of chairs against the floor echoing slightly in the otherwise quiet room. For a moment, no one spoke. He folded my hands in front of me, resting them gently on the table, and allowed the silence to stretch just enough to feel intentional. Then Olivia leaned forward slightly, her posture confident, her expression carefully composed. We have been thinking about what is best for everyone, she began, her voice smooth, practiced. And given the size of the house, the maintenance, the market right now, it might make sense to consider selling while the value is strong. He listened without interrupting, my gaze steady, my expression unchanged. She continued, outlining numbers, timelines, possibilities, each word delivered with the kind of certainty that comes from preparation, not emotion. Daniel nodded occasionally beside her, adding small comments here and there, but it was clear who was leading the conversation. He let them speak. He let them believe they were guiding this moment, shaping it, controlling it. When she finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that invites agreement. He reached for the glass of water in front of me, taking a small sip before setting it back down with care. You have given this a lot of thought, I said quietly. Olivia's smile returned, a little more confident now. We just want what is best, she replied. He nodded slowly, as if considering her words, as if weighing them against something unseen. Of course, I said. Then I tilted my head slightly, my gaze shifting from her to Daniel and back again. Tell me, I added, my tone still gentle, almost curious, when did you start planning all of this? The question settled over the table like something heavier than it should have been. Daniel's eyes flickered, just for a moment, before he looked down at his hands. Olivia did not answer immediately. That hesitation, brief as it was, said more than anything she could have offered. I let the silence stretch again, not pressing, not accusing, simply allowing it to exist. Finally, she gave a small, composed breath. We have been discussing it for a while, she said carefully. He nodded once more, accepting the answer without reaction, without judgment, as if it aligned perfectly with my expectations. Because it did. He leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands still folded, my posture unchanged. That makes sense, I said softly. And then I allowed the smallest pause before continuing. In that case, there is something you should know before we go any further. He held their attention without raising my voice, without shifting my tone, and in that quiet moment, I could see it clearly. They believed this was the point where I would yield, where I would ask for guidance, where I would step aside. But instead, I simply looked at them with calm, steady eyes, and prepared to show them just how much they had misunderstood. He let the silence settle for a moment longer before I moved, reaching beside my chair for the slim leather folder I had placed there earlier, unnoticed. It was not large, not dramatic, just something that looked ordinary enough to be ignored until it was opened. He set it gently on the table between us, aligning it with the edge of the wood the same way I had aligned everything else that day. Olivia's eyes dropped to it immediately, her attention sharpening in a way she could not quite hide. Daniel followed her gaze, his posture tightening slightly, as if he already sensed that this was not part of the conversation they had prepared for. He rested my hand lightly on the folder, not opening it yet, allowing the moment to stretch just enough to shift the balance in the room. Richard believed in preparation, I said quietly, my voice even, steady, as if I were simply sharing a memory. He did not like leaving things uncertain. Olivia gave a small nod, her smile returning, but it was thinner now, more cautious. That makes sense, she replied. He looked at her for a second, then at Daniel, letting my gaze move between them without urgency. He updated his estate documents 6 months ago, I continued, my tone unchanged. That was the first moment Daniel's expression truly shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. A flicker of confusion, quickly followed by something else he could not quite conceal. Olivia did not speak, but her posture straightened, her attention fixed entirely on me now. I opened the folder slowly, not rushing, revealing the neatly arranged documents inside. The paper was crisp, untouched, the kind that carries weight not because of its appearance, but because of what it represents. There are specific conditions, I said, turning one page carefully, about how and when anything connected to this house can be transferred, sold, or discussed. He did not look down at the page as I spoke. He did not need to. He knew exactly what it said. Conditions? Olivia repeated, her voice still controlled, but no longer as smooth. He nodded once. Yes, I said. Conditions that were put in place to protect what he built, and more importantly, to protect who he built it for. He allowed a small pause, just long enough for the words to settle. Daniel shifted in his seat again, his hands moving slightly on the table as if he did not know where to place them. What kind of conditions? He asked, his voice lower now, less certain. He finally let my gaze drop briefly to the document, tracing a line with my finger before looking back up at them. For the first 90 days following his passing, I said calmly, no discussions regarding the sale, transfer, or division of assets tied to this property are permitted. Olivia's expression held, but I could see it now, the calculation adjusting, the quiet shift behind her eyes as she tried to reframe what she was hearing. That is, estándar, is it not, she said, choosing her words carefully. He tilted my head slightly, considering her question as if it were worth weighing. Perhaps, I replied. But there is an additional clause. That was when the room changed. Not loudly. Not suddenly. Just enough to be felt. He placed my hand flat against the document, keeping it steady. Any individual who attempts to influence, accelerar, or benefit from the estate within that period, I continued, my voice still calm, still measured, forfeits their claim to it entirely. The words did not need emphasis. They carried their own weight. Daniel's gaze dropped instantly, his shoulders tightening, while Olivia remained still, her composure holding, but only just. He did not raise my voice. He did not lean forward. He simply let the silence follow, letting them sit with what had just been placed in front of them. Because for the first time since this began, they were no longer guiding the conversation. They were reacting to it. And that was exactly where I needed them to be. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt precise, like something had been measured and placed exactly where it needed to be. Olivia was the first to move, though it was barely noticeable. Her fingers shifted slightly against the table, her posture adjusting as if she were recalibrating in real time. I am sure there must be some flexibility in how that is interpreted, she said, her voice still controlled, but no longer effortless. He did not respond immediately. He allowed her words to settle, to exist on their own without interruption, and then I folded my hands neatly in front of me again, resting them lightly on the table. Richard was not a flexible man when it came to legal matters, I said quietly. That was one of the reasons his business succeeded. Daniel exhaled softly, the sound almost lost in the room, but I heard it. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze fixed on the document as if it might change if he stared long enough. 90 days is not that long, he said after a moment, his tone uncertain, searching for something stable to hold on to. He nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. No, I replied. It is not. He let a small pause follow, then added, but it is long enough to show intentions. That was when Olivia's composure shifted again, just enough to reveal what sat beneath it. Not panic. Not yet. But something sharper. Something more deliberate. We were only trying to help, she said, her voice softening, her expression adjusting into something more sympathetic. This is a lot for you to handle on your own. I met her gaze calmly, holding it without tension, without challenge. I appreciate your concern, I said, my tone even, almost warm. Truly. The word lingered just long enough to sound genuine. Then I reached forward and closed the folder gently, the soft sound of leather against paper echoing faintly between us. That is why I think it is best if we take our time, I continued, as if offering a reasonable solution. There is no need to rush anything. Daniel nodded quickly, almost too quickly, as if relieved to agree with something that did not require him to choose a side. Yes, that makes sense, he said. Olivia did not respond right away. She watched me instead, her eyes searching, measuring, trying to determine whether this was a retreat or something else entirely. He did not give her an answer. He simply stood up slowly from the table, smoothing my skirt with the same practiced motion I had used all day. I think we have discussed enough for now, I said gently. It has been a long couple of days. I picked up the folder and held it lightly at my side, not as a shield, not as a weapon, but as something I owned, something I understood. We can revisit everything after some time has passed, I added, my voice steady. Daniel stood as well, his movements automatic, his expression still unsettled. Olivia followed a second later, her posture composed once again, but her silence said more than her words had. He gave them both a small nod, polite, controlled, and then I turned away from the table without hesitation. As I walked toward the hallway, I could feel their eyes on me, not with certainty, but with something far less comfortable. Uncertainty. Because what they had expected was resistance, emotion, perhaps even weakness. What they had not expected was patience. And paciencia, when used correctly, has a way of revealing far more than force ever could. He reached the doorway and paused for just a moment, not turning back, not saying anything more. There was no need. Some things are understood without being spoken. And by the time I continued down the hall, I knew something had already changed. Not in the house. Not in the documents. But in the way they would look at me from that moment on. Not as someone to guide. Not as someone to manage. But as someone they could no longer predict. The house grew quieter over the next few days, but it was not the kind of quiet that comes from peace. It was watchful, careful, as if every movement carried weight now. He moved through my routines the same way I always had, making breakfast at 7, watering the plants by the window, folding the same set of dish towels with the same measured precision, but I was no longer moving out of habit. He was observing. Every glance. Every hesitation. Every word that was said and every word that was avoided. Olivia adjusted quickly, I will give her that. She stopped bringing up numbers directly, stopped placing documents in obvious places, but she did not stop planning. That was not something a person like her could simply turn off. It showed in smaller ways now. In the way she lingered near the study where Richard used to keep his files. In the way she asked questions that sounded casual but were anything but. Do you know where Richard kept the older paperwork? She asked one morning, her tone light as she stood by the kitchen counter. He did not look up immediately. He finished stirring my coffee, set the spoon down, then met her gaze. He kept things where they belonged, I said simply. She smiled, but it was thinner now, less certain. Of course, she replied. Daniel was quieter than before. He spent more time on his phone, more time stepping outside to take calls he did not explain. 11. I passed by the hallway and caught a fragment of his voice, low and tense, speaking. About timelines and options. He stopped the moment he saw me, his expression shifting too quickly to be natural. He said nothing. He did not need to. Because silence, when used correctly, has a way of making people reveal far more than questions ever could. By the third day, I could see it clearly. They had not stopped. They had simply changed their approach. And that was when I decided to give them exactly what they thought they wanted. That evening, I set the table again, just as carefully as before, but this time there was something different in the air. Not tension. Not hesitation. Something calm. More certain. When they sat down, Olivia's eyes moved across the table, searching, measuring, trying to understand what had shifted. Daniel watched me more directly now, as if waiting for something he could not name. He folded my hands lightly in front of me and gave them both a small, composed smile. I have been thinking, I said, my voice steady, almost reflective. Olivia leaned forward slightly, her attention sharpening instantly. About what? She asked. He let a small pause settle, just enough to hold her focus, then continued. About what you said, I replied. About the house. De Timin. De Marquet. I saw it then, the flicker of satisfaction she tried to hide, the subtle shift in her posture as she believed the conversation was turning back in her favor. And, she prompted gently. He nodded once, as if agreeing with something reasonable. You may be right, I said. It might be worth exploring options sooner rather than later. Daniel straightened slightly, his expression lifting just enough to show relief, while Olivia's smile returned, more confident now, more certain. I am glad you see it that way, she said. I held her gaze for a moment, calm, steady, letting her settle into that certainty. Then I reached for my glass, took a small sip, and set it back down with care. But, I added softly, the word landing without force, if we are going to do this, we should do it properly. The room stilled again, not sharply, but enough to be felt. Olivia's eyes narrowed just slightly, her attention sharpening once more. What do you mean? She asked. He leaned back just a fraction, my posture relaxed, my tone unchanged. I mean, I said evenly, we should involve the person who prepared everything. He let the words settle before continuing. Richard's attorney. This time, neither of them spoke immediately. And in that quiet, I could see it clearly. They had expected agreement. They had expected movement. What they had not expected was oversight. And as I sat there, calm and composed, I realized something with complete certainty. They were no longer planning freely. They were reacting carefully. And that meant the balance had already shifted. The next day unfolded with a kind of quiet precision that felt almost rehearsed, as if every movement had already been decided before it happened. He made the call in the morning, standing by the same window where I had stood countless times before, watching the garden Richard had planted with his own hands. The attorney answered on the second ring, his voice steady, familiar, unchanged by everything that had shifted on my end. We spoke briefly, just enough to confirm what needed to be done, just enough to set something in motion that could not be undone once it began. By the time I hung up, the house felt different again. Not heavier. Not lighter. Just clearer. Olivia noticed it immediately. She always did. You seem settled, she said later that afternoon, her tone carefully neutral as she leaned against the kitchen counter. He met her gaze without hesitation. I am, I replied simply. There was nothing more to add. Daniel hovered nearby, his presence uncertain, as if he were waiting for something to reveal itself. It did not have to wait long. I have arranged a meeting, I said, my voice calm, almost conversational. Tomorrow morning. 10 o'clock. Olivia's posture shifted, just slightly, her attention sharpening in an instant. A meeting, she asked. He nodded once. With Richard's attorney, I said. The words landed exactly as I expected them to. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to change the air between us. Daniel's expression tightened, his gaze dropping briefly before returning to me. Olivia's smile did not disappear, but it changed. It became more careful, more deliberate, as if she were already adjusting her approach. That sounds appropriate, she said after a moment. He inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her response without confirming it. I thought so, I replied. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but not without meaning. Every glance carried more weight. Every silence stretched a little longer. They were both thinking now, recalculating, trying to understand what the next day would bring and how they would position themselves within it. He did not interrupt that process. He allowed it to unfold naturally. Because uncertainty, when left alone, has a way of revealing more than any question ever could. The following morning, I was ready before either of them came downstairs. I dressed with the same care I had taken for the funeral, choosing a simple navy outfit, nothing elaborate, nothing distracting, just something that reflected exactly what I felt. Composed. Certain. When Olivia entered the room, she paused for a fraction of a second, taking in the details, measuring the moment. Daniel followed behind her, quieter, his expression more guarded than before. We left the house together, but not as a unit. There was distance between us now, not physical, but understood. The drive was silent. He watched the road ahead, my hand steady on the wheel, the familiar streets passing by without drawing my attention. When we arrived, the building stood exactly as it always had, unremarkable from the outside, but carrying a different kind of weight within. We walked in together, the sound of our footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors, And I could feel it then, the shift I had been waiting for. Not in me. Not anymore. In them. Because for the first time since this began, they were not certain of what would happen next. And uncertainty, when it replaces confidence, has a way of changing everything before a single word is even spoken.